Good evening. I'm Jim Meiskens, interim president here at the Graduate Center. Welcome. We're delighted to have you join us for this sold-out program. As New York City's public graduate school, the home of advanced research, PhD work, and master's degrees, we're proud to be a hub for New Yorkers to visit and to be part of today's most important conversations. This fall brings another terrific lineup of public programs here at the Graduate Center, including discussions on topics such as the mystery of black holes, to the future of global capitalism, conversations with prominent figures such as Michael Bloomberg or Oliver Sacks, and tonight, of course, Robert Caro. Now, if in the future you cannot make it to the Grad Center for any of these many conversations we have, I want you to know that all of our programs are live streamed. Now, we put biography at the center of so many of our public programs because it offers us such a compelling insight into history and the essential perspectives of society. As our honored speaker, Robert Caro, has shown us, biography also gives us sometimes all too human views of politics and power. Underscoring this is our co-sponsor tonight, the Graduate Center's renowned Leon Levy Center for Biography. Through the leadership of the Levy Center, prominent biographers come to the Graduate Center to write, to discuss their craft, and to speak about their work. Each year, 5 independent biographers receive generous annual fellowships to work on biographies, in addition to support for graduate students working on biographical subjects. And in a first-in-the-nation program that takes advantage of the rich intellectual life here at the Levy Center, students interested in studying biography and memoir and in writing them are coming here for our new master's program in biography and memoir. I'm also honored to welcome Shelby White, founding trustee of the Leon Levy Foundation, for generously funding the Leon Levy Center for Biography. Would you please stand? You recognize? No? Well, we'll applaud you anyway. All right. Now, I have the pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Kai Bird, for here, is a renowned biographer and the executive director of the Leon Levy Center. He's co-author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning biography American Prometheus, The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer, is the author of the memoir Crossing Mandelbaum Gate, Coming of Age Between Arabs and Israelis, and The Good Spy, The Life and Death of Robert Ames. His latest project is a biography of President Jimmy Carter. Tonight, of course, we welcome our guest and one of our most celebrated biographers, Robert Caro, to discuss his latest fascinating subject, Robert Caro, as he portrayed himself in his work, the new book, Working. Caro is the author of The Power Broker, Robert Moses and the Fall of New York, and his multi-volume study of Lyndon Johnson. He's been the recipient of virtually every major literary honor, and in 2010, he was awarded the National Humanities Medal by President Barack Obama. The president upstaged us by 1 year. The Graduate Center awarded him an honorary degree in 2011. So please welcome and join me in welcoming Robert Caro to the stage.
Thank you, Bob. It's a real pleasure. Welcome.
Happy to be here.
We're going to jump right in. We're going to have a conversation for about 40 minutes, and there will be questions afterwards from the audience. Bob, I want to begin by telling you that right outside my office upstairs, I have a framed New Yorker cartoon from 1985. And it shows a struggling author at a typewriter in the basement, surrounded by manuscripts, piles of manuscripts and books. And his wife is clearly standing at the top of the basement stairwell, looking down, and he's looking back up and he's saying, "Finish it? Why would I want to finish it?" And I have that framed for my biography fellows and to remind me of, you know, actually the pleasure that we biographers take in our craft. We just like doing the work, don't we? Don't you just love being a biographer?
I like finishing.
Okay. And you've finished quite a few books.
Eventually, yes.
I also, as a biographer, I'm frequently asked if I have to like my subject. And you know, I've written biographies of John McCloy, a powerful Wall Street lawyer, Robert Oppenheimer, and McGeorge Bundy, all rather difficult men.
Yeah.
And you too have chosen powerful, difficult white men, Robert Moses and LBJ. But you wouldn't say you have to like your subject to be able to tackle a biography, would you?
No, I wouldn't say you have to like them. The interesting thing for me is how you find out about them, you know.
It's the chase.
I only knew about Robert Moses, you know, the figure who toured, you know, slum clearance, who evicted tens of thousands of families, really, for his highways and his urban renewal projects. I didn't know the young Robert Moses, the idealist who built Jones Beach, you know. So that was a real discovery.
And, well, let me push this a little further. Would you be willing, let's say, to write a biography about a truly despicable character? Let's say Roy Cohn.
Well, if I thought, you know, I don't think of my biographies as just lives of a man. I never was really interested in writing a book just to tell the story of a famous man. From the first time I thought of writing about Robert Moses, I thought of writing that book would be a way of explaining, finding out for myself, and then trying to explain how political power worked in cities, not what we're taught in textbooks, because obviously he wasn't getting his power from what we're taught in textbooks, because in textbooks we're taught we live in a democracy, so power comes from being elected. So here's Robert Moses, who was never elected to anything, and he had more power than anyone who was elected, more than any mayor, more than any governor. He had this power for 48 years, almost half a century, and with it he shaped our whole world that we live in here in New York, and I had no idea where he got this power, and really neither did anyone else.
So no one does. So you were just curious to figure out where this powerful man had come from and how he exercised his power and influence.
Yes.
Well, to pursue this a little further, when I first met McGeorge Bundy, whom you're now writing about in the course of your fifth volume on LBJ, I was a college student, and he walked into an auditorium like this and gave a speech. And I was convinced, along with all of my fellow students, that this man must be a war criminal. And then decades later, I spent 8 years writing his life, and I got to know him more. And he was a prickly, difficult interview, but I learned to sort of place him in context, in the history. And, you know, what he did with regard to Vietnam was I mean, it was still a tragedy, but I figured out how to place him as a victim of historical circumstances and of his time. So I guess I'm sort of inching up to asking you if you're grappling with the same feelings with LBJ and Vietnam today in your 5th volume.
You mean why he got into it, why he escalated?
Yeah.
Well,
Are you seeing him sympathetically or?
Well, you're seeing him whole because we have so many documents have come open now, and we have these telephone transcripts. So sometimes, Johnson did a lot of his work, his persuading of Congress and all, on the telephone. So there are days in which he forgets to turn off the tape recorder. I'm just writing about one now, when the tape recorder is really on from 1 o'clock till about 6:30, till 6:28 in the afternoon. So you have 5 hours and 28 minutes of Lyndon Johnson talking to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, to McGeorge Bundy, at the same time that he's escalating the Vietnam War, in the very same days, he's passing Medicare. And it's quite a feat. You sometimes say, I say anyway, that I don't know that we would have Medicare today if Lyndon Johnson hadn't been president then, to seize that moment. So you really get a chance to really hear what political genius really is the only word, what political genius is as it's exercised.
And he was a powerful man who was trying to wield power for the public good. At least he would say that, right?
Well, it's more complicated than that.
All right, I'm, as you know, I'm in the midst of writing about Jimmy Carter, another president.
Yes.
And Carter has, at least one of the themes in my narrative so far is that he is just as ambitious as a Lyndon Johnson, politically. He knows how to win the presidency, to get inside the White House. He does what is necessary, and he's going to do it, whatever is necessary. And he campaigns for 2 years out on the road and is relentless. But he had a firm, almost religious belief that once you achieve power, you have to act selflessly and without regard to politics. Now, this is not at all what Lyndon Johnson did in the White House. Johnson, you know from your first 4 volumes, wheels and deals and cuts, gets what congressmen want in their districts. Carter did just the opposite. He studied an issue and would decide what is the right thing to do, and then he would do it regardless of the political consequences. So my question is, in a way, Johnson does some of this, in that he does civil rights in 1964, knowing that it's going to lose him Democratic votes in the South. And why doesn't he have the courage to buck the establishment when he's being told that he has to, by people like McGeorge Bundy, that he has to stand firm in Vietnam?
Well, Johnson, if you take Lyndon Johnson's life, you see it's really the same character throughout his life. So when he's 19 and 20 years old, Johnson he's very poor, and he's going to what they call the poor boys' college in Texas, and he has to drop out between his sophomore and junior years to earn enough money to go on. So what he does during that year that he takes off is to go to a little town in Texas called Cotulla, which is to teach in what was called the Mexican school, because the children are all the children of migrant workers. And I wrote, after studying that year, no teacher had ever cared if these kids learned or not. This teacher cared. He cared so much, he considered it very important that they speak in English. So if he heard someone at recess, if he heard a boy yelling something in Spanish, he'd run out and spank him. And if it was a girl, he'd run out and tongue lash her. And then you see him, for years having to pretend, really, that he's on the side of the South until he gets enough power. So he's now president. 4 days after he becomes president, he has to give a speech to a joint session of Congress, and he's not even in the Oval Office yet. He's still living at home. And downstairs in his kitchen, 4 of his speechwriters are gathered around the table writing that speech, and he comes down in his bathrobe and asks them how they're coming along. They say, the only thing we're sure of is that you can't make civil rights a priority. If you make it a priority, if you try to push for civil rights, the Southerners who control Congress are going to do the same thing to you that they did to Kennedy's legislative program. They're going to stop everything. So civil rights may be a noble cause, but it's a lost cause. Don't fight for it. And Johnson says, well, what the hell's the presidency for then? And of course, in his speech, he says, our first priority must be to pass the Civil Rights Bill. And when he's making another speech on that bill, the phone suddenly rings on the desk of his speechwriter, Richard Goodwin, and Johnson is on the other end, and he says, you remember, Dick, I used to tell you about teaching those kids in Cotulla. Let's put that in the speech. And Goodwin says something like, well, you know, really the question is sort of insulting. I don't remember his exact words. Are you sincere in this, or is this just a political thing? And Johnson says, you know, when I was teaching there, I swore that if I ever had the power to help these kids, I would do it. Now I have the power, and I mean to use it. So you see in all Johnson's life, from beginning to end, the same themes. He's the same human being from beginning to end. But it's a human being of great contrast.
So initially, when I first tried to tackle my first biography on John McCloy, he refused to talk to me for 2 years.
Yeah.
And I understand that Moses also refused to talk to you for a long time.
Yeah.
How did you wear him down?
Well, I didn't wear him down, you know. Actually, nobody wore him down. But he would, you know, no one had ever written a biography. There was one biography, but it was like a puff job done by someone on his staff, actually. But a number of biographers, including very famous biographers, Rexford Tugwell, had signed contracts to do biographies on Moses' life. And I think in each case they stopped, and I think they probably stopped because it was said to them what was said to me, that he'll never talk to you, his family will never talk to you, his friends will never talk to you. And that's enough to rule. And then they also said, and you'll never get to see his papers. And of course, he had somehow persuaded the courts in New York State that the papers of his public authorities should be as private as the papers of a private corporation. So what I decided to do, just since we're all interested, what I did was I put a dot in the center of a piece of paper, and I drew concentric circles around it. So the dot was Robert Moses, and the innermost circle was his family, his close family. Then the next one was his cousins and all, and then there were his friends, etc. So I figured he could stop everybody on the inner circles from talking to me, but he couldn't possibly remember all the people in the outer circle. So I started with them, and I was doing a lot of interviews. And I later found out that people were saying to him, oh, I met this young man who's writing a biography of you. And suddenly, out of nowhere, one day, his daughter called, Jane, and she said she used to call him Papa Bear. So she said, Papa Bear says he'll talk to you. So I went out to see him. I'll tell you what it was like. So he had... If you look at Jones Beach, beyond Jones Beach, there's a little community called Oak Beach. It's a little community of modest summer cottages. And Robert Moses had the last cottage in the corner. And what he had done was he had torn out the walls, 2 of the walls in the living room, and replaced them with just glass. So out the left-hand wall, you saw Robert Moses Causeway. Out the right-hand wall, you saw the tower of Robert Moses State Park, and he sat in the corner in this big leather chair. So there was Robert Moses surrounded by his monuments. And we had 7 interviews. They weren't really, they weren't really interviews, because you'd ask him a question, and he would just start off talking, and you didn't want to ask any questions, because as soon as he started, I realized that I thought I knew something about politics because I've been a political reporter. I realized that here was a guy whose mind was operating in terms of political power on a level that I had really never even dreamed of. It was such a, I'll take another minute.
Yeah, absolutely.
So on one level, he remembered everything. And he remembered the pragmatic things. He said, I was asking about something about Jones Beach, and he said, oh, look, I can't imitate his voice, but it was something like, he says, well, it was 8-7 against us in Assembly Ways and Means, but the 8th vote was Stevens of Cattaraugus County. And Stevens had a mortgage on his farm, and the mortgage was held by the First State Bank of Rochester, and the way to get to the First State Bank of Rochester was so-and-so. So it changed to 8-7 for us. But at the same time, he had this ability, he would jump up. In his offices, in each of his offices, and he had 12 offices. In each of his offices, he had a huge map of New York City and Long Island and Westchester and parts of New Jersey bordering the Hudson. And when he could get excited and talk to you about something, he'd jump up like a kid. And so he always had an aide or 2, assistant or 2 sitting behind him. And he used to use these yellow pencils, if you can all remember what a pencil is, with a sharp point. And he'd go like this, and an aide would slap the pencil in his hand, and he'd go over to the map and he'd say, can't you see? If we put the highway here, we can put the parks there, and then we'll have public housing here. And you realized that here was a guy who was seeing the entire metropolitan region like it was one painting. And he had drawn a plan on it in 1924, and he had spent the next 44 years filling it in. And I said, if you want to write this book honestly, you have to show, like we think of genius in terms of a Picasso in front of a canvas, or a Beethoven crossing out his notes on a music manuscript. You have to show there's a different kind of genius, a genius of public works, and this is the guy who had it. So you try to get all that into your book. I don't say that I succeeded, but you try to get that both sides in.
So that first interview turned out to be very valuable. It gave you insight into...
Well, I had seven interviews, but there came a time when I had to start asking him questions,
Uh-oh.
And I had worded, I just had something I had to ask him about, and it involved one of the great robber barons, a guy named Otto Kahn on Long Island. And it was a secret that he had kept that no one had really known for, I think, 42 years, I think, off the top of my head. And as soon as I worded it, I really worked out the wording of it, so it would be as circumspect as possible. But he was a lot smarter than I was. And the minute the word Otto Kahn came out of my mouth, I saw his eyes change. And very quickly after that, he said, well, that's enough for today.
Uh-oh.
And I never saw him again.
And you never saw him again.
I never saw him again.
So you've written both about Moses and LBJ. Is it harder to write about the dead or the living?
Good question. Well, Moses was hard because he was in power when I started. He was right at the
And he was still living, and he
Yeah.
couldn't.
Johnson, but the good thing about it was, I remember was asked that before, the good thing about it was I got to spend really 6 days and at least an hour of the 7th interview with him. And so you felt you knew him better for that. So you really wish, I really wish I had met Lyndon Johnson, you know.
Didn't you meet him just briefly once?
Yeah, I shook, yes, I was a
his
member
hand.
of the press pack once,
Right.
and I shook his hand. Yeah, that was the, yeah.
But now you have the telephone transcripts.
Yes. So that's a revelation.
And you can actually hear his voice.
Yes, it's a revelation.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, it's wonderful, and it should be a new tool for finding the truth out about history, because you're really finding out the unvarnished
Right.
way
And
he got things done.
unfortunately, no president is going to put a taping system in the Oval Office anytime soon, huh?
Well,
So, for obvious reasons. So, in reading Working,
yes.
I wanted to ask you what you thought was your best interview, most revelatory. And I'm guessing maybe one with like Tommy the Cork, but maybe I'm wrong. But you have an exciting anecdote about meeting Tommy the Cork and having Tommy lead you on a investigative journey.
Oh, well, I think what you're referring to is I became friends with him. There was an aide to, he had been an aide to Franklin Roosevelt. He played the accordion. He was a real Irish raconteur, full of stories.
A fixer.
And a fixer, yes. And Washington is real, he was the fixer. And we actually became quite, you know, friends. He used to call me Kid, you know. So in doing Johnson's papers, I learned that there was a turning point in Johnson's life where he first got national power when he was still a very young congressman, and that it had happened in October 1940, just before the 1940 election. And I asked Corcoran, you know, what happened in that month, and he said, money, kid, money. But he said, but you're never going to be able to write about it, kid. And I said, why not? And he said, because you'll never find anything in writing. Johnson never put anything in writing. But in fact, eventually I did find something.
And you tell in the book how you...
Yeah, yes.
And you say that for a president, it's not possible to, quote, turn every page,
Yes.
which is one of your mottos, I know. In the archives, you've got to turn every page. But with Lyndon Johnson, there are 35 million pages. So, so you tell this story in Working, and I find it really interesting in that it shows how you decided what to look at. You can't possibly look at 35 million pages, but here's the story that Tommy Corcoran told you, and you wanted to follow the money.
Yeah.
But I was disturbed. The punchline of the story is that you actually found a box filled with folders, and you found the evidence in a folder that was marked general.
Yeah. It was actually marked.
And you were turning every page again.
Well, it was marked general unarranged, actually, yes.
Right. Let's see. In Working, you also write that you try to keep yourself out of the narrative.
Yes.
That reminds me, George Packer, in his new book on Richard Holbrooke, does just the opposite.
Yes. Yeah.
But as a rule, I think biographers want to keep themselves out. On the other hand, James Atlas, who just passed away recently, in his lovely memoir about being a biographer, he wrote about biographers being the shadow in the garden. You know, that the biographer is there, hovering, and you bring to the page your own prejudices and opinions, and it's inevitable. It's not objective history as such. It's, you know, we're only human. So prejudices did you bring to bear, you think, in retrospect, when you wrote about Moses or your first 4 volumes on LBJ? Was there...
Well, it was sort of opposite.
Okay.
Because as I think I said, with Moses, I knew only this figure of when I was in high school. He was the guy who was ramming the Cross Bronx Expressway and all these expressways across New York and evicting people, you know, with 90 days to get out, and creating new slums as fast as he was supposedly erasing the old ones. So as I said, it was really a revelation to learn about this idealistic young man, you know, who really thought of Jones Beach, because Al Smith said to him, you know, it's the automobile age and the Irish have cars in New York City. Al Smith, he meant all the lower middle class, Al Smith, but he always talked in terms of the Irish. Find them a place where they can bathe in the ocean like the rich people do. And to listen to Robert Moses, you know, talk to me. So my prejudice was that I was prepared, you know, to see him this way. And I realized there had been, until he was about 35 years old, a very different Robert Moses. So what made him change from one to the other? That's really what The Power Broker, in my mind, is about, you know? And what's the consequences in terms of political power of a man changing like that? And Johnson was the opposite, because I thought of Lyndon Johnson really as the guy who passed, was responsible for Vietnam, as you say.
Right.
And I found out, you know, how hard it was for him, how he always had this strain of compassion, whether it was in the civil rights area or in bringing electricity to poor people in the hill country. I didn't know anything about that. So your prejudices are constantly being altered by what you're finding.
Right, you're being challenged. I admit, by the end of my biography on Bundy, I no longer thought he was, quote, a war criminal. It became a little more complicated.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So I want to ask you a question about Janet Malcolm, the New Yorker writer,
Yes.
who's been a sort of critic over the years of biographers. She's called us voyeurs and burglars. How do you respond to that charge?
Well, it's been a long time since anyone called me a voyeur.
Her words.
Yeah, I'm not sure what she means. When I read it, I wasn't sure what she meant by it, and I'm not sure now what she meant by it. But I think, you know, biography, we're all hopefully trying to find out the truth. You know, that's what you think you're trying to do. Maybe you're not really trying to do that, but that's what in my point of view, I'm trying to find out how political power really works, because political power is what shapes all our lives and shapes it every day in a lot of ways we don't realize. And I thought my feeling was learning about Robert Moses. No one understood how power worked. You know, so I'm not quite sure what that, you know, I remember you find out, whatever you think you know, you find out you really don't understand at all. I remember when I was a reporter still for Newsday, Robert Moses was trying to build another bridge across Long Island Sound from Rye to Oyster Bay. You know, he built the Triborough and then the Bronx Whitestone and then the Throgs Neck. And if he had had his way, he would have covered Long Island Sound with bridges all the way out to Orient Point. So now he was up to Rye, Oyster Bay, and I was a reporter, young, on Newsday, and I had won a couple of awards, minor, really minor journalistic awards. But if you're young and you win any sort of an award, you feel you know everything about the subject. And I thought I knew everything about political power. So I investigated this bridge, and I found out it was the world's worst idea. And I wrote a series. You know, the bridge would have had to be, first I said, it would have generated so much traffic, because all the traffic from New England would have come down over, that the Long Island Expressway would have required 12 more lanes just to handle that traffic. And the bridge would have had been so big that the piers would have actually caused pollution in Long Island, tidal pollution in Long Island Sound. So I wrote that series, and I thought the bridge was basically dead, and I said, I'm done. You know, I did that. Then I had a friend up in Albany then, and a couple of weeks later, he called me and he said, Bob, I think you better come back up here. And I said something like, oh, I don't think so. I think I took care of that bridge. And he said, well, you know, Robert Moses was up here yesterday, and I think you ought to come back up. Now, before, I had talked to Rockefeller, the Governor Rockefeller, and his counsel, I remember, who was involved in this guy named Sol Corman. I talked to the Assembly Speaker, a guy named Tony Travier, the President of the Senate, and they all agreed this was the worst idea in the world. Everyone understood that. So I went back up, and I remember walking into the press gallery as the Assembly was authorizing this bridge by a vote of something like 183 to 4. I don't and it's like, I remember driving back from Albany that night and thinking, you know, you don't know anything that you've been writing about. You don't know the truth about anything you've been writing about, because everything that you write underneath it, even though you don't say it in every article, everything is based on the assumption that power in America comes from being elected. And as I said earlier, here was a guy who was never elected, and he could turn the whole state government around in 2 weeks. And in fact, when I went back and talked to the same people, the governor, the Assembly Speaker, et cetera, who had told me that they understood it was such a bad idea, now they all thought it was a great idea. So for me, it's less a matter of prejudice than a matter of curiosity, if you want to know the truth.
So I want to take a moment to say that we're going to be passing these note cards around for people to write questions over the next few minutes, and we'll get to your questions shortly. So if we biographers are not thieves or rogues, or in Malcolm's words, voyeurs or burglars, I think we're on actually a treasure hunt, and you have suggested this in working. And so I wanted to ask you, looking back over your decades as a biographer, what single discovery in the archives do you remember as most exciting? You know, was it Louis Sallas's manuscript of Box 13, or was it these LBJ telephone transcripts, or...
Well, the one you mentioned, there have been a number of them, but the one you mentioned, Louis Sallas, was sort of a great thrill. So this was, for those of you who haven't read Working, and for those of you who haven't, the test is Tuesday. So in 1948, Lyndon Johnson won an election. First he was 10,000 for the Senate. First he was tens of thousands of votes behind, and then all of a sudden he was only 87, he was only 100 and some votes behind. And then at the last minute, beyond the last minute, in fact, 6 days after the election, suddenly there was found in the desert outside in South Texas a ballot box from Precinct 13, Box 13. And when they opened it, there were 202 ballots, and 200 of them were from Lyndon Johnson. One was for his opponent. And the thing about it was that these people had all voted with the same handwriting. and they had voted in alphabetical order. So all the previous biographies on Johnson had said, no one will ever know if he stole that election. It's just ordinary Texas politics. But I felt I couldn't really be writing what I wanted to be was a complete biography of Lyndon Johnson and say, no one will ever, I won't even know if it was stolen. I couldn't do that until I had done everything I could to try to find out if it was stolen. And I was told that the election judge of that Precinct 13, a man that Louis Sallas, who was like the pistolero, the in mafia terms, the enforcer for this notorious border boss who controlled all the counties down there, had been the precinct judge of this precinct. And then someone told me that, in fact, he was still alive. But he had committed a murder and had went back to Mexico. And, you know, when you ask me why my books take so long.
No, I didn't ask you that.
trying to find a Mexican man who doesn't really speak English, who's fled back to Mexico and moved from town to town for the last 40 years. Takes a lot of time. But I finally found him, and in fact, he had moved back to Texas. He was living in a trailer behind his daughter's home in Houston. So I didn't want to give him a chance to say no, or he wouldn't talk to me. So I just flew over there, and I knock on the door. Now, in the book that I wrote about, when people are talking about him, he was a man 6'4" and very strong. He wore a Colt revolver with a barrel that was so long that it reached almost to his knee. So I knock on the door, and I'm expecting to be looking up at this guy, and instead this frail old man answers the door. And I say something like, "My name is Bob Caro, and I'm writing a book about Lyndon Johnson." And he says, "Oh, then you want to know about Box 13. So I allowed as how that was probably true. And we went inside. You know, it was a wonder. I can say that because you asked what the best moments is. This is the best moment. So I still remember, he was very old, and his wife was in a rocking chair in the adjoining room in this mobile home, and she was obviously not at all well, and she was wrapped up in a blanket, and every so often he would get up and adjust the blanket around her. And he started telling me about Box 13. He said, "You know, Robert, I have written it all down." And he goes over to this trunk, and he pulls out of it a manuscript that he has written. The first page says Box 13. And the first sentence is something, "Soon I go beyond, but I want my children to know we put Lyndon Johnson on the path to the presidency. If he hadn't won this election, he wouldn't have gone to the Senate and be president." And I'm leafing through this book, which had 87 typed pages and 12 handwritten pages that he had added to it. And I see that it is the story of exactly how these votes were stolen. And I asked him, "Can I copy it?" And he said yes, and we went to a 7-Eleven, which was not far away. And I stood there as these pages came out. So it's still in my, that was a great moment. But to tell you the truth, there are a lot of moments that are really, I mean, I enjoy doing this. You know?
It is a treasure hunt, and
yes,
it's
a treasure hunt
exhilarating.
is exactly right, Kai. Yeah, it is.
And that's why it takes us a long time. We got to track down that one more source.
Yes, yes.
But you also write in Working that you say rhythm matters
Yes,
in the writing,
yes,
and that the writing is really just as important as finding out the stories. You've
Yes.
got to tell the stories. It's got to be a narrative.
yes.
And, you know, that sort of makes me think that good biographers are sort of novelists with thousands of footnotes.
That's very
But that raises a question here in the academy, in universities. I'm not a product of the academy. I don't have a PhD in history. I came, like you, to biography as a journalist. And yet there's this tension I see in the academy between academics who think that the theory is more important than the story, the narrative, and that they don't place as much emphasis on the writing.
yes.
That's a shame, isn't it?
Yes, I think it is, and it's something that you're doing, you know, a lot to combat here. People, if they don't read your book, then what is the good of what you found out? But beyond that, if you want to tell a story, history is a story. If you want to tell a story, you have to make the reader see the scene in which it's taking place. And that takes, it takes sometimes that's hard to do. I mean, it's very hard for me to do, But unless you are doing that, how do you make the reader understand what's really going on? How do you make a person understand what a triumph it was of Lyndon Johnson when he's a young congressman to bring electricity to this remote area of the United States, unless you've made the reader see how remote and isolated and impoverished this area was before. So I'm always thinking, I have to do that. Like when I write in The Power Broker, just to say one quick thing. So I wanted to show the human cost of Robert Moses' expressways. For his expressways, he evicted, by a very conservative estimate, and I wanted to take a number that he couldn't possibly challenge, so it's really conservative. He evicted 250,000 people for his expressways. So I was trying to think, how do I make people see that? And that took a lot of trying to figure it out. I finally said, I'll take 1 mile and really show that. I'll stop talking. So I'll take 1 mile and try to show that in detail. I'll try and show what was there before. So what I really had to do was show what the neighborhood was before he ran this highway through and dispossessed all the people. So I think both of them are important.
So, looking at all the sources that you use in a biography, oral histories, your own interviews, these telephone transcripts, letters, diaries, they all give us a little bit of the truth, right? But they are in each kind of source has its own suspect moments, right?
Yeah.
So can you talk about which do you value of these sources? What is the most impeccable source? A telephone transcript, a diary, the interview?
I don't think any source is impeccable, to tell you the truth. I mean, you really have to do your best to to find out what's wrong with each account that you're given, and then you try to find the written material. Sometimes you're lucky enough to find the actual documentation. Sometimes you're not, so you have to do. A lot of people don't understand what interviewing is. I mean, let's say you had Johnson you have to keep going back to people over and over again. Let's say you're in the White House, it's a conference on Vietnam. So the real decisions on Vietnam Johnson made were not in the cabinet, and they weren't made in the National Security Council. They made it something that he called the Tuesday lunch. Every Tuesday at 1:30, he met with 4 people. So Dean Rusk sat on his right, and next to him was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a guy named Bus Wheeler. On his left was McNamara, and next to McNamara was Walt Rostow, okay? And so you would say, okay, we have the minutes of this meeting. Not that he allowed minutes, but the thing was he had to have someone sitting in the corner with a stenographer's notebook, because if they decide to bomb certain villages, somebody has to write down what villages they are, right? So you have the notebooks, and then you go to Dean Rusk, for example. This isn't a real example. And you say, what did it mean when you said this in the minutes, right? Then you go to McNamara and you say, what did you think of what Rusk said? Then you go to McGeorge Bundy or Rostow and you say, then you go back to Rusk and you say, well, they say this. So it's a constant going back and forth. I think that's the best I can answer your question.
That's another reason why it takes so long.
Yes.
So over the years, you've interviewed hundreds of people, maybe thousands. But some people sometimes refuse to talk. And I notice in Volume 4, in your acknowledgments, you make a point of saying that Bill Moyers declined to be interviewed for your fourth volume.
Yes.
And I wonder why, and has he changed his mind yet?
No, he won't talk to me.
He won't talk to you?
No. No.
Some people won't talk, I guess, yeah. No. So, you write 3 pages a day, you say, in working.
Well, no, I try to write 3 pages a day. Working.
Is that double-spaced pages?
Yeah, but they're legal.
Or handwritten?
No, well, the handwritten you can't tell, they're all different.
Right.
But I use legal paper because you can get more lines on a page. I triple space them because you're an old newspaper man. You can edit. I do a lot of editing and crossing out, and when you triple space, you have more room. So I try to do 3 of those pages a day.
So that's like 3 pages, legal size is probably at least 900 or
It's about
1,000
1,000
words,
words. Yeah, just
1,000
about
words a
1,000
day.
words, yeah.
I think that's a lot. My target is only 350 words. And that's what I'm telling my biography fellows, but it's hard to do even that. It's difficult.
Yeah.
But you do have to have some kind of quota, some kind of target.
Otherwise, that's why people ask why I wear a tie and jacket to work, to remind myself, because I have a terrific publisher who never asks me, when am I going to deliver, So my books take so long that, it's easy to fool yourself that you're working. So I try to remind myself that it's a job, and that's why I wear a tie and jacket.
So I have one more question, and then I'm going to read a few questions from the audience. In working, you say that your only researcher over all these years has been Ina.
Yeah.
So what do you tell budding biographers if they don't have an Ina?
I can't tell. Ina, stand up for a second. Tough luck.
I guess so. All right, I'll read a few questions here from the audience. Someone asks, biography explains and demystifies. Over time, do episodes in a recorded life revert back to mystery and more ambiguity for you?
I'm not sure I understand the question, but...
I guess the question is, biography explains and demystifies a story, but then maybe over time, 2 or 3 decades down the road, it becomes a mystery again, and another biographer has to come along and...
Oh, well, it's more... Well, it's sort of... That's a good question. What really happens is people tell the same stories so often in their life that they come to believe it's true, even if it's not true. I mean, a real example of that is Ina and I became great friends. And I should say, I was going to say, what I really say is other biographers, if you look in the acknowledgments, have 3 or 4 research assistants, sometimes 5. I've had only 1 researcher. Ina has written, of course, 2 great books of her own about French history. But I'm lucky enough to have had her. She's my whole team of researchers. But so Ina and I became great friends with a man named Horace Busby, whom Lyndon Johnson called Buzz. He picked Buzz out when he was the editor of the University of Texas student newspaper, and he wrote speeches for him for 30 years. Nobody really knows his name. But we would go out to dinner every week in Washington. I had 24 formal interviews with him. I think I actually know there are 146 typed single-spaced pages of the transcripts of those interviews. And he told me this wonderful story to explain to me how he always knew Lyndon Johnson was for civil rights. And it's a great story. And it happens in the 1948 campaign. And they went to a town called Cleveland in Texas. And railroad tracks went through the center of the town, and the blacks live on one side, the whites on the other. And Lyndon Johnson has to make a speech, and the speaker's platform is set up right at the tracks. And he says, you know, I'm not going to start speaking until all those people can come over here. What a great story. And Busby really believed this. So I just want to get some more details, and Johnson used to take detailed notes on each campaign thing as soon as he pulled away. So I asked the library for the notes on his trip. He was never in Cleveland. So when you talk about ambiguity and things becoming, yes, that's exactly right.
So another question from the audience. What advice do you have for young biographers who are often overwhelmed with information?
Well, you're often overwhelmed with information. I don't know how to answer. You're often
Turn every page.
You're often overwhelmed with it. That's why I try to make outlines, so that you sort of know where you are. But it doesn't always work. I mean, it sounds good, but it doesn't always work. But I try and make an outline of the book so that I know where I am anyway. But the answer is you're often overwhelmed with stuff. Yeah.
There's always more, too.
Always, and there's always more. And in Vietnam right now, they're still opening stuff in the Johnson Library. Yeah, just 50 years ago.
Yeah, there's always more. Another question, what figure would you like to write a biography of going forward? Who is the Moses, the Robert Moses of today?
Well, the biography, of course, that I'd love to do, I've said this before, is Al Smith. Al Smith is the character in politics that I find most appealing and significant in history, And he's utterly unknown. There are a couple of books on him, and they make this fascinating guy sound boring. But I'm not going to get to do it.
So did the voice or inflection of the calls ever change your mind about what the content meant versus what was written in the transcript? I guess this is pertaining to telephone.
Oh, very much. That's a terrific question. No, in these telephone you read the transcript, which I read all the transcripts before they were opened. They're opening them, as you go along. Yes, the tone of voice. I mean, people think that Johnson was always talking. That's the image you have of Johnson. But when you hear, and this doesn't show up in the transcript, sometimes there's a silence. Johnson isn't saying anything. The other guy, and he's waiting for the other guy to start talking again. And Johnson doesn't say anything until he figures out, and then what the guy really wants, or what the guy is really afraid of, or whatever. And then he has, then you hear when he's threatening somebody. And no matter what you think Johnson was like, I mean, that really can make you have goosebumps.
So inflection matters.
Inflection, sure. Just like if you were sitting across a dinner table from someone at a dinner party. If you were actually watching their face and hearing them talk, it would be better than hearing a transcript. Yeah.
Okay. Now this is a long one. In reading Working, I was struck by certain parallels between your methods as a biographer and those of your subjects. All three of you share an obsessiveness of pursuit. All three of you share an obsessiveness of pursuit. All three of you harbored, I guess all three meaning Moses, LBJ, and yourself. All three of you harbored expansive visions realized over a long period. All three of you noticed possibilities others have overlooked. So, do you identify with Moses and LBJ, or did you become this way through writing about them? Well...
Some of these questions I don't want to answer. I think friends of mine from Horace Mann, because there's still some of us, four of us who worked on the school paper together, and we have dinner together about once a month, would say I've always been sort of the same. That's not a compliment.
Most people have a transformation.
Yeah, well,
So no comment.
oh, well, the question is, I think I was always, I don't know how you describe, I don't, you know, what are the adjectives that the question, obsessive? I think I've probably always been sort of like that. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you.